I didn't realize what was happening.
It started so small that I cannot point to a single moment and say, there, that was when it began. That is the thing I have had to make peace with, the absence of a clear origin point. Because without one, it is easy to keep asking yourself why you didn't see it sooner, and the answer is simply that there was nothing clear to see. We had been together for about 8 months when the first rewrite happened. We had argued about something minor. I no longer remember the original subject. And afterward, when the air had cleared and we were talking again, he described the argument back to me in a way that was subtly but completely different from how I remembered it. Not different in the way that two people always experience the same event differently, shaped by their own perspectives and emotional states. Different in a more specific way. In his version, I had said things I hadn't said, had reacted in ways I hadn't reacted, had started something he had actually started. I corrected him. He looked at me with a particular expression, patient, slightly concerned, not angry, and said he was worried about my memory, that this had happened before, that I sometimes remembered things in ways that didn't quite match reality. I felt the ground shift slightly under me. I went back over the argument in my mind, searching for the version he was describing, wondering whether I had somehow missed my own behavior. I did not find it, but the seed had been planted. Over the following year, that seed grew in ways I could not track in real time because I was inside it. I began to trust my own recollection of events less. When something felt wrong, I would run it through a filter. Am I remembering this correctly? Am I being fair? Is this actually what happened, or is this my version of it? That filter, which began as a reasonable attempt at self-examination, became something else over time. It became the habit of doubting myself first, automatically, before I had even assessed what I was doubting. My sister noticed before I did. She noticed that I had started prefacing things with phrases like, I might be wrong about this and correct me if I'm remembering this wrong, in situations where I had previously had no trouble speaking with certainty. She noticed that I checked my phone anxiously during dinners, that I gave a lot of explanations for things that required no explanation, that there was a particular quality of carefulness in the way I talked about my relationship that had not been there before. She did not confront me dramatically. She asked once quietly whether I felt like myself. I said yes. She said okay and left it there. I did not feel like myself. I had stopped knowing exactly what myself felt like. The clarity came gradually rather than suddenly through a combination of therapy and distance, a work trip that lasted 2 weeks and gave me, without intending to, the experience of existing in my own head without the constant proximity of someone else's version of reality. During those 2 weeks, I noticed that my memory worked fine. I noticed that I made decisions without second-guessing the process. I noticed that I did not feel confused or foggy or worried that my perception of events was unreliable. I ended the relationship 4 months after that trip. The conversation was difficult in the specific way that conversations are difficult with people who are skilled at reframing. He had an explanation for everything, a version of events that made my leaving into a misunderstanding I would eventually regret. I let him finish, and then I left anyway. What I learned: the most disorienting thing one person can do to another is make them distrust their own mind. It does not require cruelty. It requires only consistency, a steady, gentle pressure applied to your confidence in your own perception until the confidence gives. If you find yourself constantly wondering whether your memory is reliable, whether your feelings are proportionate, whether your version of events is accurate in ways you never wondered before a particular relationship, that is not a personal failing. That is information about what is happening to you. Trust it.
I was the last one in the office every night for 3 years. I said this with pride for most of those 3 years. The way you say things that have become part of your identity before you have examined whether that identity is serving you. My manager praised my commitment. My colleagues joked affectionately about my hours. I had built a reputation around a particular kind of relentlessness, and the reputation felt good, and so I protected it by continuing to be relentless, even on the days when relentless was the last thing I had left in me. I did not recognize what was happening as burnout because I had a specific image of burnout that did not match my experience. I thought burnout looked like collapse, a person unable to get out of bed, unable to function, visibly falling apart. What I had looked nothing like that on the outside. I was productive. I was engaged in meetings. I delivered everything I was asked to deliver and several things I was not asked to deliver because the asking had become unnecessary. I had internalized the expectations so completely that I generated my own. What was happening on the inside was different. The work that had once genuinely interested me had become purely mechanical. I did it with the same quality and none of the same feeling. The way you might go through the motions of a conversation while thinking about something else entirely. I stopped having ideas that felt new. My thinking, which had once felt expansive and generative, began to feel like it was operating inside a narrowing corridor. I would sit in front of a blank document with something to say and find nothing. Not writer's block exactly, more like a dimming, a reduction in wattage. I told myself this was just a busy period, that I needed a vacation, that a week off would reset everything, that the flatness was temporary and circumstantial. I took the vacation. It helped for about 10 days. Then the corridor narrowed again and I was back where I had been, staring at the blank document, generating output without generating anything that felt like thought. The conversation that finally penetrated was with a mentor I trusted, a woman who had known me professionally for several years and who had watched my trajectory with genuine investment. She asked me during a routine catch-up what I had enjoyed recently. Not at work, just recently in my life. I started to answer and realized I was struggling to find examples. She watched me struggle for a moment and then said quietly that she was concerned, that the person she was looking at did not look like a person who was thriving, and that she hoped I would take that seriously. I did not take it seriously for another 4 months. Then my body made the decision I had been avoiding, a series of physical symptoms that my doctor connected directly and explicitly to chronic stress, the kind that does not resolve with a single vacation or a long weekend, the kind that requires a structural change. Recovery meant reducing my hours in a way that felt, initially, like professional failure. It meant accepting that my value was not proportional to my availability. It meant sitting with the discomfort of being a person rather than a machine for a while, until I remembered what that felt like and stopped missing the machine. What I learned: burnout does not always look like breaking down. Sometimes it looks like functioning perfectly while something essential inside you goes quietly dark. The absence of collapse is not the presence of health, and the praise you receive for overworking is not a reliable signal that overworking is sustainable. Your output is not your worth, and the dedication you are so proud of may be the thing that is slowly costing you the most.
My divorce was finalized on a Thursday in March, and I went back to work the following Monday because I had decided, with the kind of deliberate practicality that I had always mistaken for emotional strength, that the best thing I could do was keep moving. The marriage had been over long before the paperwork confirmed it. We had been living parallel lives inside the same apartment for nearly 2 years before either of us said out loud what we both knew. By the time it ended, I felt mostly relief, which I took as evidence that I had already processed the grief and come out the other side. I had not processed anything. I had simply not started yet. The relief was real, but it occupied only the top layer of what I was carrying. Underneath it, unexamined, was everything else. The grief not just for the marriage, but for the version of the future I had planned around it. The particular loneliness of failing at something you had promised yourself you would not fail at. The quiet shame that I was too sensible to admit to, but that showed up anyway, in small ways I didn't connect to their source. For about 8 months, I was fine in all the visible ways. I worked well, socialized, dated a little, kept my apartment clean, exercised. From the outside, I was a person who had handled a difficult thing and moved on with admirable efficiency. From the inside, I was operating on a kind of autopilot whose fuel source I did not examine because the plane was still in the air, and that seemed like sufficient evidence that nothing was wrong. Then, in November, I watched a film that had nothing to do with divorce or loss and cried for 40 minutes, in a way that was entirely disproportionate to anything happening on the screen. I sat in the dark afterward and understood for the first time that I had been storing something for 8 months in a room I had not opened. Therapy was where I finally opened it. What was inside was larger than I had estimated from the outside. Not just the grief for the marriage, but older grief attached to it. The grief of a person who had been taught very young that feelings were most safely managed by being filed away rather than felt, and who had applied that teaching with such consistent efficiency that she had become genuinely skilled at not knowing what she was carrying. The process of learning to feel things in real time rather than storing them indefinitely was slow and uncomfortable, and occasionally felt ridiculous. Sitting in the therapist's office, crying about things that had happened years ago that I had thought were long resolved, that turned out to have been waiting patiently in that room all along, but the alternative, which I now understood from experience, was the 40-minute cry in the dark over a film, the body insisting on what the mind had been refusing. What I learned: grief does not expire because you decide not to feel it. It does not resolve because you keep moving, or because enough time passes, or because the relief you feel is genuine. It waits, and the longer it waits, the more accumulated interest it carries when it finally arrives. The most efficient thing you can do with grief is feel it, which is the one thing that feels most inefficient when you are inside it. Give yourself the room. The room is not weakness. It is the only way through.
It began with a period of genuine difficulty, a job loss at 31 that lasted longer than expected, a gap of 7 months between one income and the next, during which I made a series of financial decisions that each felt individually, like a reasonable response to a temporary situation. Credit cards for the months when savings ran short, a loan for a car repair that couldn't wait, small amounts borrowed and not yet repaid, folded into the general category of things I would sort out when I was back on my feet. I got back on my feet, and then I did something that I now understand is very common and at the time felt entirely logical. I got back on my feet and kept moving forward without looking back. The new job absorbed my attention. Life reorganized itself around the income. I paid the minimum amounts required to keep things quiet and did not sit down and calculate what the actual total looked like. Because sitting down and calculating felt like the kind of thing you did when you were ready to deal with something, and I was not ready to deal with it. I was busy being relieved that the hard period was over. The minimum payments became background noise, just numbers that left my account every month, portions of a whole I had stopped examining. I knew vaguely that the whole was larger than it should be. I had a sense, loose and deliberately unexamined, that the interest was doing something I would not like if I looked at it closely. I filed the sense in the same room as other things I intended to address eventually and closed the door. 3 years passed. The income had grown. The life had stabilized, and the background noise of minimum payments had become so normalized that I had stopped hearing it at all. It was my then girlfriend, now wife, who asked me directly early in our relationship whether I wanted to talk about the credit situation on my report. She had not looked at my credit report improperly. We had been discussing the possibility of eventually moving in together, and the conversation had arrived naturally at finances. She asked the question in the specific way she asks difficult questions, which is directly and without apology, and with enough warmth that the directness doesn't feel like an attack. I had not looked at my own credit report in 3 years. I looked at it that evening. The number I found was more than double what I had been carrying in my loose and unexamined sense of things. 3 years of minimum payments had done almost nothing to the principal, while the interest had quietly, consistently, arithmetically done exactly what interest does when you let it run undisturbed. Addressing it took 18 months of structured effort, a plan, a budget that actually reflected reality rather than aspiration, a systematic working through of what I had allowed to accumulate. It was not fun, but it was, by a significant margin, less bad than I had imagined it would be, which is the thing about looked at problems versus unlocked at ones. The imagination almost always makes them larger. What I learned, avoidance is not neutral. When it comes to anything that compounds, debt, health, relationships, anything with an interest rate of its own, looking away is not the same as standing still. It is moving in the wrong direction at a rate you have chosen not to calculate. The number you are afraid to look at is not improved by not looking at it. Open the statement, run the calculation. Whatever it says, it is better to know it now than to know it later when it has had more time to grow in the dark.
Diane and I became close quickly, in the way that sometimes happens between two people who recognize something in each other before they have enough information to understand what that something is. She was funny and perceptive and paid a quality of attention to me that felt, at the time, like being genuinely seen. I had been through a difficult year, and she arrived in my life at a moment when I was perhaps more grateful for closeness than I was careful about its terms. The first thing I did not notice was that she was always slightly negative about the other people in my life. Not overtly, she was too smart for that. It was more textured than direct criticism. A slightly raised eyebrow when I mentioned a friend she hadn't warmed to. A gentle concern expressed about whether a colleague I liked was actually trustworthy. A pattern of small questions and observations that consistently left me feeling slightly less certain about the people around me, though I could never have pointed to any single conversation and called it manipulation. Each one was, individually, just conversation. The second thing I did not notice was that she required a level of availability that had gradually restructured my schedule. Not through demands. She never made explicit demands. Through disappointment, which is more effective. A certain quality of quiet hurt when I was busy that made rescheduling feel like something requiring more justification than it should, until I found myself planning my week around her expectations rather than my own priorities. The third thing I did not notice was that I had stopped talking to several people I had previously been close to. The stopping had happened gradually through a combination of the slight uncertainty she had seeded about them and the simple fact that my available time had narrowed. I had not decided to see them less. It had just happened, and I had not questioned it because each individual instance had an individual explanation. I saw the full shape of it only when I had to cancel plans with Diane for something genuinely unmovable, a family obligation, not negotiable, and her response was disproportionate in a way that she did not manage to fully contain. It was the first time the disappointment had come with an edge, and the edge was sharp enough that something in me stepped back and took in the whole picture for the first time, rather than each piece separately. What I saw from that small distance was a version of my social life that had been quietly reorganized around one person, and a collection of other relationships that had been allowed to thin while I hadn't been paying attention. I saw that the closeness I had experienced with Diane had come with conditions I had never explicitly agreed to, and I understood that the attention she had paid me so generously at the beginning was not separate from the control that had arrived with it. They had been the same thing, expressed at different stages. Rebuilding the friendships I had let drift took time and some difficult honesty about why they had drifted. Most people were more understanding than I deserved. One was not, and I accepted that. The distance from Diane was not dramatic. I simply became less available in the way she had never allowed me to be, and the friendship contracted accordingly without ever requiring a formal ending. What I learned, the people who make you feel most seen are not always the people who are good for you. Attention can be a form of control when it comes with the implicit cost of your other relationships. Pay attention to the direction your social world is moving, whether it is expanding or quietly, steadily contracting, and ask yourself honestly, whose interests that contraction is serving.